Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. I've got a very special guest joining us today on I think, a pretty monumental occasion, considering what's happening in China right now with the 80th anniversary of the Chinese victory over fascism. Joti Brar is a British political activist, author, and is known for serving as the chair of the Communist Party of Great Britain, the CPGB-ML, and her writings on anti-imperialism and socialism. Joti, I'm very happy to have you here today. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks, Jackson. Good to be with you.
I want to start off by talking about these events in China and really the political and geopolitical dimension of it. Obviously, President Putin is no communist, but what do you think it means for us as communists, as anti-imperialists to see, I guess, President Putin and Xi Jinping reviving this old Soviet sphere? You have President Putin working very hard to build up BRICS and collaboration with the SEO and direct ties with North Korea, with Vietnam, with Cuba, Venezuela, anti-imperialist countries in Africa. What does this mean and how should we interpret it?
It's very significant, Jackson, isn't it? And really, as you said, we're seeing the coming back together of an anti-imperialist camp that was split after the death of Stalin. So at the point when Stalin and Mao were in charge of People's Soviet Union and People's China, we had a socialist and anti-imperialist camp with a unified leadership that really sang from the same hymn sheet, if you like. They were in lockstep with one another, and the future for humanity looked incredibly bright. It looked like we could only go forwards from there. Unfortunately, with the death of Stalin, and basically what you had a coup in the party in the Soviet Union, revisionists came to power who essentially put the Soviet Union on the road back towards capitalist restoration. And one of the first things that they did, that the Khrushchevites did, was to break links of cooperation with People's China. They had been helping the Chinese to industrialize. They had been helping them to develop their planned economy and their modern agricultural basis. All of those specialists who were there helping with that were withdrawn unilaterally by Khrushchev. And that was a big blow to China and to the socialist camp. That was the beginning of what was known as the Sino-Soviet split. The repercussions of revisionism in the USSR and the split between socialist China and the socialist Eastern European camp have been catastrophic for our movement. But we're finally coming to a point now, I think, where all anti-imperialist countries are recognizing their need to stand together, no matter what their guiding ideology is. So Russia, as you say, is not the Soviet Union. President Putin is not a communist. He doesn't want to be, but he is forced by life to be a strong anti-imperialist. And the stronger his understanding of the irreconcilable hostility of the imperialist camp to Russia as a strong sovereign nation. It turns out it wasn't just that they were communists that the West hated, it was that they were sovereign. It was that they did what they decided was best with their resources, with their manpower, with their wealth. This is what the West can't forgive, right? So even though the Soviet Union is gone and Russia has become capitalist, and Russia tried very hard to be a partner in the international scene with the West, they found out that the imperialists are, what did Lavrov say? Agreement incapable. And that means, of course, that you can't trust a word they say. They will never treat you as equals. They will never respect you. They will never recognize your rights to be sovereign. They demand total subjection. They demand the right to loot your resources, and the only government they will recognize is one which facilitates that. They only recognize comprador governments around the world. They don't recognize sovereign and equal heads of state in the way that I think a lot of Soviet people and Russians later assumed that they would do. They took the words of the imperialists at face value and didn't understand what Lenin taught us so long ago, that the system of imperialism has its own logic and it can't be trusted. So now we're seeing, really since the SMO, really the launch of the special military operation in Ukraine, we're seeing this deepening sense of an anti-imperialist reality in Russia, and bringing back of the understanding of the importance of alliances across the world on that basis, and the deepening of ties with China, with the DPRK, as you said, with Latin America, with Africa. And in all of those ties that are being revitalized, what is the legacy that is explicitly and implicitly being lent into? It's the legacy of the socialist Soviet Union. It's the legacy of a time when the Soviet Union was a country that treated other countries with respect, that had relationships of fraternal solidarity, where countries understood that in the battle against imperialism, they must stand together, they must work together, they must support one another economically and militarily in order to survive and thrive. And that's what we're seeing. And it's a really fantastic turn of events, actually. It offers a lot of promise for the peoples of the world.
You mentioned Stalin and Lenin. One thing I've noticed in my time in Moscow here is that, and this is a trend that is reflected in the Western world in various ways, but there is a renewed love for Stalin, even amongst the youth. And you see these statues going up, the re-Stalinization, they call it. But for Lenin, not so much. You know, there's a lot of animosity towards Lenin still, and you see that reflected in the West. There's a lot of lies spread on Lenin's name. Why do you think that Stalin is treated with such reverence, but Stalin, who considered himself the greatest student of Lenin, Lenin is, cast away into the shadows, and he's lied about so much?
And I also consider Stalin to be the greatest student of Lenin. I think his life's works bear that out. And it's a travesty that the people who are coming to love and respect and look back with fondness and nostalgia for the legacy of everything that Stalin led the people in building in the Soviet Union have been tricked into believing that that was something separate from Lenin and Leninism and the October Revolution and the Bolshevik Party, when of course it was the exact and faithful continuation of all of the life's work of Lenin and the Bolsheviks prior to Lenin's death and prior to the revolutionary period. I think it's an interesting turning on its head in a way, because when the revisionists in the Khrushchev period and later were wanting to attack really the dictatorship of the proletariat and Leninism, they didn't dare to do it in the name of Lenin because Lenin was so revered. They started by attacking the pupil of Lenin. They started by attacking Stalin. But the attacks were meant for Lenin also. In the name of Lenin, just like Trotsky did, in the name of Lenin, they attacked Stalin, but they were attacking Leninism. Now we have the reverse. The people are looking back with pride and nostalgia to everything they achieved for themselves in the Soviet period of socialist construction, which of course was headed up by Joseph Stalin. And so they associate Stalin with all the wonderful things that the Soviet Union was able to achieve. But they are still subject to a massive capitalist propaganda campaign that says that what Stalin did was somehow about Russian nationalism rather than about socialism and communism, rather than being about implementing Lenin's vision, the Bolsheviks' vision of a planned economy in a Soviet socialist union.
Yes, I agree with you fully on all of that. And it's very troubling to see. It's very disheartening to see, but hopefully that trend corrects itself and people wake up to what's going on. I want to ask you also about some topics related to the United Kingdom in particular. Why do you think it is that in the UK, there's a lack of mass left politics? And this is, as an American, we have the same thing here. And it seems to me as though a lot of American organizations on the left are maybe a little bit too focused on the wrong issues. They're not focused on the meat and potato issues. Have you seen the same sort of trend in the UK with these well-funded, popular organizations on the left? And what do you think can be done to actually get people focused on what average people care about?
You know, Jackson, the only time that Britain had a really strong, really vibrant, really class conscious and militant working class movement in the 20th century, at least, was when there was a strong communist movement at the core of it and at the grassroots of it, driving the militancy, driving the class consciousness, driving the demands for change, and pushing the leadership, which was always compromised, pushing them to take much more militant positions than they wanted to. But they found that they had to in order to retain any credibility and retain their positions, right? So the reality in the West is exactly as was outlined by Lenin during the whole period of World War I, from 1914 to 1917. Lenin's big battle was against opportunism. It was the fact that what was supposed to be a homogenous socialist movement across the whole of Europe suddenly was split in two, and the leaderships revealed that their loyalty was not to the working class and to socialism, but to imperialism. They all sided in France, in Belgium, in Holland, in Germany, in Britain. The leaderships of the socialist parties all sided with their own belligerent ruling classes in the inter-imperialist war, which just 2 years earlier, they'd said the workers had a duty not to cooperate with. And yet, as soon as the war broke out, they were voting for war credits and they were mobilizing the working class. And the whole socialist movement, the Second International, basically fell apart under this contradiction and split into two. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks were the only party that stuck to the original program, which was mobilize the workers against the war, persuade them to turn their guns against their own ruling class, and turn this terrible carnage into a revolutionary opportunity for transformation to socialism. That's what gave birth to the October Revolution. That's what gave birth to the whole era in which we've been living since, which is the era of rising socialism. But the other socialist parties in imperialist countries, their leaderships all showed that their rottenness. They had become rotten during the peaceful period. They'd become careerists. They'd found that they had a nice life. They got bribed off as long as they stayed loyal to the system. Now, we have had a total continuation of that politics by what Lenin called the labor aristocracy, the leadership, the privileged section of the workers, and the leadership that's foisted onto the working class in the trade unions, in the Labour Party, in our mass organizations. The leaderships of all these mass organizations can be characterized that way. To a certain extent, they were forced into taking more militant positions in the period between the wars because there was a very strong communist-led, Bolshevik-aligned, Soviet Union-aligned, class against class oriented communist party that was driving them from the roots. After World War II, the communist parties across the West allowed themselves to be bought off. It came at the same time as Khrushchevite revisionism in the Soviet Union. In the West, the welfare state and the bribes that were given to workers for a kind of better life than they'd been having before World War II, the communist parties allowed themselves to change their position from class against class, and we need a revolution to establish a socialist planned economy, to if we just vote for the right party and, you know, keep working in the trade unions, we will step by step arrive at socialism. Well, in fact, what we got was we step by step retreated from every position the working class had conquered to the point now where we're in total disarray, where no worker, even though they're members of trade unions, they don't trust the leaderships of their trade unions. They don't participate in the elections for the leaderships of their trade unions. They don't go to the trade union conferences. They feel completely alienated from this class of professional trade unionists who serve the other side, who constantly act as a mechanism for suppressing their struggle instead of facilitating its success. So for me, the lesson is very clear. Number one, no concession won under conditions of capitalism can be considered permanent. You have to fight every day to keep it, and every day you'll be being pushed back. Under conditions of capitalism, everything you win is temporary, right? And we see that now, how much has been taken away and how much more they've got their eyes on to take back, and how the living standards of the poor section of the working class in the West is sinking and sinking to the point where it's going to be indistinguishable from the living conditions of workers across the exploited world, which many British people thought they would never go back to that. But we're seeing now that is where we're going back to. And the only answer is we need once again mass organizations where the grassroots is led by communists, who not only are demanding much more militant, revolutionary and class-conscious action by the leadership, but who are also hammering home the lesson to workers that in order to have gains that last, we actually have to not just settle for concessions, we've got to take the whole thing down.
In the UK, migration is a very big issue that I see discussed on social media. Obviously, most people discussing this issue, they leave out the fact that mass migration is a creation of the capitalists and the warmongers and the architects of illegal sanctions. But it is a reality now in the UK, as it is in the US and many European countries. What should be the role of communists in educating people about mass migration, and what should the communist response be towards actually addressing this situation and the material changes that your country is facing as a result of it?
I think we have to make it very clear, Jackson, to the working class that this whole scapegoating of migrants is a massive exercise in deflection and diversion. It's aimed at getting workers' attention off the fact that it's the continued development of finance capital. The export of capital is what took away industrial jobs from people who now are, third generation unemployed or underemployed. It's the imperialist buying off of the leadership of our trade unions that took away our rights at work and left us on insecure 0-hour contracts. It's not migrants that did any of these things. In fact, the migrants are victims of the same system that we are victims of. And getting workers to fight other workers only helps the ruling class in stopping us from getting together to fight the system. And fundamentally, I think that's the way we have to understand this question, that as soon as we allow ourselves to get wrapped up, caught up by any aspect of the immigration narrative, we are doing the ruling class's job. It's their number one weapon against the working people. If you look at the works of Marx and Engels all the way back to the middle of the 19th century, they were pointing out, and this was long before, any of the immigrants were brown, right? But they were pointing out how the mass migration of Irish workers into Britain was a phenomenon that was helping the ruling class to keep the proletariat divided. They said in every city there were Irish workers and English workers, and they were kept busy hating and fighting one another. And the Irish workers lived in much worse conditions than the English workers. They were paid worse wages. They lived in worse slums. They were discriminated against in thousands of ways. And the bourgeois press encouraged the native workers to look down on the Irish, to see them as somehow subhuman, to see them as having a weird culture and a weird religion, and all the same phenomena we see now directed at Muslims or East Europeans or whoever, Africans, whoever the target might be today. What we see is the need for cheap, hyper-exploitable migrant labor force has never left the capitalists, and nor has the need to divide and rule us by setting us against one another and making us feel superior to other sections of the population, or making us feel that, it's their fault our wages are bad, rather than recognizing if we want to fight for better wages, we've got to fight together, right? So the thing is to make sure that migrants demand of our unions that anyone who comes as a migrant worker is in the unions and are not in a position to set up this two-tier wage system. We have trade union leaders now who have facilitated this whole process of two-tier working conditions and then use that situation as a justification for why they can't really achieve anything for their members. But they helped it to happen. They absolutely facilitated the whole process. It's not the migrant workers' fault that they're in the situations they're in. Most of them never would have left where they started from if it wasn't for imperialist war. So the two things we should be focusing on if we don't like the situation we see is, number one, do something to stop the war machine that's ravaging the rest of the world, right? It's our imperialist class that's going around making other people's lives impossible. And they come back here because this is where the wealth of their nations is being brought to, right? It's not their fault that that's the reality that they've been born into. The other thing we should be doing is demanding that our trade unions do their bloody job, right? Pardon my French. So that all people are in unions no matter what. If that was the case, we'd have a much better chance of fighting for decent wages for everybody, rather than constantly having this pressure of an ununionized, hyper-exploitable working force that pulls down pay and conditions for everybody else.
On another note, I saw some news a few days ago. It said that Britain still is intent on recognizing Palestinian statehood, which was shocking to me because, as I understand, the government recently recognized Palestine Action as a terrorist group. These activists of all ages, all backgrounds that are fighting against the genocide in the UK. So what is the goal of Starmer recognizing a Palestinian state? And does this materially change anything for the people who are starving and getting bombed each day living in Gaza?
I mean, to the second part, it changes nothing, of course. That's why the government feels happy to do it. They continue to daily provide intelligence information to the IDF through their flights that are taking off from Cyprus every day. They're doing, the British Air Force is doing surveillance flights over Gaza every day and passing information for targeting purposes to the Israelis. So the idea that it's something separate from Britain is for the birds. This is an Anglo-American genocide, and the Israelis are simply executors of that plan. The people who are really in control, really funding it, really directing it, they're in London and they're in Washington. So we have to be very clear about this, where the criminality, the head office of the criminality is. For everything that we see that's disgusting about Netanyahu and his government, about the settlers, about the Zionist ideology and supremacist mindset, all of that was created in London. Zionism is a philosophy and an ideology that was dreamt up by Christians in London in the 19th century and pushed onto the Jewish people as a useful tool because they wanted to control the Middle East. So we have to recognize that's what we're looking at. It's a British crime. It's an American crime. It's an imperialist crime. When it comes to saying that they will recognize a state of Palestine at a point where Palestine is totally occupied and all the forces that are fighting for Palestine's liberation have been proscribed as terrorists by the British government, it's a joke, isn't it? What it is meant to do is provide a SOP where the narrative constructors of the mainstream media can pretend that Britain is, number one, a neutral kind of arbiter, or outside the conflict. Number two, can pretend that they're doing their best in the difficult situation to do the right thing. Of course, they stand with the Jews. Of course, they stand with the Arabs. You know, of course, they stand with Israel. Of course, they also recognize the difficulty of the Palestinians. It's total nonsense. You know, this is a narrative to make some liberals who feel a bit bad about what's going on feel slightly better. It does nothing to help the people of Gaza or the people of Palestine, either to stop this particularly intense phase of the genocide or to get liberation. They are, whenever they talk about recognizing Palestine, they talk about trying to put together, like it's their job to decide who the Palestinian government is, that we'll put together some kind of a government, i.e. they want to find some proxies who they can recognize as a Palestinian government that isn't recognized by the Palestinian people themselves. We mustn't forget that the reason the siege on Gaza started, which was back, what is it now, 2007? It's getting on nearly for 20 years. I think it was 2007, I could be wrong. But it's getting close to 20 years, Jackson. I remember when it started thinking they couldn't possibly continue it for so long. You know, in 2009, I felt sure that any day now that, you know, the people of the world wouldn't allow this to continue, right? Look how long they've been squeezing Gaza. Why did they start that siege? They started it because the people in Gaza elected the wrong government. They'd been told to have an election by the Americans. It was demanded that they should have an election. They had an election. The Americans didn't like the result. The imperialists didn't like the result. And they started the siege on Gaza, right? Which has been slowly strangling the people there all this time. And you wonder why they gave up all ways of peaceful resistance. They've tried absolutely everything. The national liberation struggle was bound to rise again. It's a historical fact that where you oppress, there will be resistance. And the Palestinian people have been resisting their occupation, colonization, genocide, and eviction from their homes and their lands for, ever since 1948, but particularly since the mid-60s. And this is just the latest wave of that. And actually the reality that we see, for all the criminality, all the destruction, all the death and devastation, when we look at what's happening in Palestine and Israel today, what we're actually seeing is that Israel is teetering on the brink of collapse, and the resistance forces, far from being destroyed, are still as strong as ever.
Yes, it's it's obviously horrifying, but I agree that Israel is playing a risky game for its own future by introducing all of this chaos and bloodshed. One thing that maybe is not on the risk of collapse, though, is this very odd phenomena of young Zionist white males in the UK. What is this? What is this situation with Tommy Robinson? I don't understand it, because his rhetoric, it seems like the type of guy that's saying, Britain for the British, and just would be a hardcore nationalist, Britain first, this sort of stuff. But then he's draping himself in an Israeli flag. He's a complete idiot. And also notably being astroturfed by Elon Musk. What is going on here? Help me understand it, because I'm completely lost.
Well, being astroturfed by Elon Musk, I think, gives the game away a little bit. Tommy Robinson, whose real name is, I think, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, he is essentially a state asset. I have had a lot of pushback online for saying that. People go, how can you say that? Look, he's just speaking up for us. And anyway, they wouldn't put their own in prison. Of course, he does good work for them in prison, and they get him out every time they need him. And whenever he tweets, it gets promoted massively. His whole job is to push from a supposedly anti-establishment position, the anti-immigrant narrative. It is very interesting to me, and it shows two things. Number one, the importance of Zionism to British imperialism, that they want their street level bully boys to associate with Zionism and to see it as their type of supremacism, even though, of course, the traditional kind of white supremacism has always been anti-Semitic. But now they're supposed to include the Jewish, who, of course, are not really Semites, but we won't get into that whole thing. But they want to include European Jews in their definition of, the superior white men, as opposed to those awful brown people, especially the Muslims, right? And the promotion of Islamophobia is a big part of all of this. There's a very strong narrative being pushed in Britain that the problem with Muslims is they have this culture that makes them violent and rapey. And it's total nonsense, okay? Of course, as we know, class society is what produces most of these problems. And we know that the child molesters in chief and the people traffickers in chief, the pimps in chief, the drug dealers in chief, and are the same people as the warmongers in chief. They're all people in nice offices in the City of London and in Wall Street. Right? These are the ones ultimately directing all these operations. They find it useful to be able to racialize various parts of their crime empire. So in America, you might have an Italian mafia, you might have Albanian drug gangs, you might have Pakistani grooming gangs. Although I have to say, on the whole grooming gangs thing, the media has presented it like, oh, it's Pakistanis who do it. They've focused on the places where it has been, what's the word I'm looking for? Delegated to local Pakistanis whose jobs were taken away from them, 2 decades ago. But all around the rest of the country, those grooming gangs exist, and they're not Pakistanis. They just don't make the headlines.
They exist in our own governments.
Right,
I mean,
exactly. Exactly. Epstein exactly has showed that this is a systemic issue. Systemic. There are files from Northern Ireland showing how royalty was involved in these scandals of grooming, taking kids out of care homes. Basically, the ruling class thinks the working class, They think of the working class in their own countries the same way they think of the masses in the oppressed countries. Got nothing to do with color of skin. They do not think we are real humans. They think we are expendable and usable fodder. You know, if they happen to like having sex with little boys, then someone will arrange it for them. And there's a whole network of that. But there's also, you know, we've seen through Epstein that it's also a way you bring in the top people from all spheres of the country, whether they're business people or they're politicians or they are media people. If you bring them into your, you know, depraved orgies and make them part of your world, they feel special, like they're part of the gang. They have a loyalty to you. But more than that, you've got compromising material on them if they ever decide to step out of line. And you see that that seems to be a systematic way of operating for the British ruling class and the American ruling class. And you know, that percolates through the whole of our society from the top down. It's not something about Pakistani culture that there are grooming gangs. It's something about the decadent, depraved culture of our imperialist ruling class that there are these grooming gangs. So we have to recognize that Tommy Robinson is a state asset. It's well documented. The original title of his first organization, which was called, I think, the English Defence League, EDL, was English and Jewish Defence League. So right from the beginning, there was this attempt to tie it into a Zionist narrative. You see the same craziness in Ukraine. Now, this is super crazy. People who, on the one hand, are followers of Stepan Bandera, right, the World War II Nazi who led the massacres and pogroms against Poles and Jews and wanted to wipe out Slavs, what they called, I mean, they're the same people, Ukrainians and Russians, but they had this crazy supremacist ideology that said, no, we are real Europeans and those Slavs are Mongols and we have to wipe them out. And they had the Nazi type final solution plan that they wanted to execute and did their best to execute and massacred hundreds of thousands of Poles and Jews in Ukraine at the time of the Nazi occupation. That's what Bandera was in charge of, right? That's what he led. That's his movement. That's the legacy that's now being resurrected in Ukraine. The Banderite fascists who are being groomed once more to be cannon fodder and like the Israelis, are very kind of I've forgotten my words, you know, ideologically motivated army for the imperialists. They are, at the same time that they revere Stepan Bandera, you will see them waving Zionist flags. So, you know, and these are people who literally called for the wiping out the extermination of every Jew. So, you know, they don't have a coherent, really, worldview. They are useful tools, totally brainwashed, historically illiterate. You know, unfortunately, they are just brainwashed foot soldiers for the imperialists, and they create these brainwashed armies wherever they go. ISIS is another one of them, you know. They are the West has got very good, and the British started this a long time ago in their imperial maneuverings at taking people's cultures or their revolutions and their religions, finding aspects of their religions that they could make useful, kind of weaponizing them and building a whole new religion out of it. So the Islam that the ISIS people follow was created by the West. It's got nothing to do with, you know, the Islam of the Middle East. The same with the Judaism that the Israelis follow, and the same with the kind of Orthodox Christianity that the Banderites say that they follow. You know, these are artificial constructions whose whole role is to turn people into willing foot soldiers for imperialist aims.
Joti Brar, I think that's an excellent point to wrap up on. Thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was extremely insightful. And I'm sure I hope it doesn't cause you any problems in the UK with your censorious government. But where should people follow you along online if they want to stay up to date with your work?
Oh, thanks. So I have a Telegram channel, which is just my name, Joti Brar. My party has a Telegram channel, The Communists, with an S. Our website is thecommunists.org. And we have a YouTube channel, Proletarian TV, where there's, hundreds of fantastic speeches on all kinds of topics. So it's really well worth subscribing to that and keeping up with that.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Jackson.